Hello folks, and good morning. Welcome to a little bit of an unexpected review here for Crimson Shroud. So why are we looking at Tactics Ogre Reborn? Well, the thing is, the 3DS is a very difficult thing to get recording. You either have to go and mod the console itself, or you have to go through one hell of a song and dance in order to be able to actually get the thing, properly running on something else. You have to go dump all of the stuff out for it. And frankly, it's just a bit too much for right now. But we're going to go ahead and look at Reborn here, because Crimson Shroud is in many ways an interesting middle point between Tactics Ogre PSP and Tactics Ogre Reborn. There's a lot of things that, while not directly a kind of like one-to-one comparison, you can tell that a lot of the ideas were there that later ended up making it into this one. So that's kind of the lens that I wanted to approach this from. The game's interesting in its own right, and like I mentioned, it's on the 3DS. It was a 3DS digital-only title. So unfortunately, this also means that there's no legal way to obtain it at this point, but, you know, where there's a will, there's a way, and what have you. If they did re-release it somewhere, honestly, they really should. It really won't work on anything but a 3DS, but it's a pretty darn neat title. Also, I totally forgot about Reflection on him. Oh, well. Anyway, so what the hell is Crimson Shroud? Well, imagine if somebody made a D&D campaign, like literally the entire game is told in figurines. Imagine if somebody made a D&D campaign out of Tactics Ogre PSP and then just kind of riffed on some ideas a bit. That's more or less what we're looking at there, where you're telling the story of kind of three endgame characters that are trying to find the, I guess you could call it the local equivalent of the Holy Grail there, or the Crimson Shroud in their case. Technically, there's more to it, but that's kind of the Cliff Notes version, right? So what makes it interesting, though, is that while you do have the standard, clearly Matsuno writing going on there, you actually have a whole lot of similar story beats that you may recognize happening. What's interesting is that, like I said, it's all from a sort of D&D perspective. So there's a lot of dice rolls and things like that end up happening. And many of the reviews that I saw out there seemed to kind of, I don't want to say like misunderstood the dice rolls, but more so, I guess, didn't really explain what they do. Like, one of the main reviews that I saw before I actually ended up picking it up was somebody saying that, oh, they determine absolutely everything that you do, and they sort of do, and that you could just instantly die from random failed dice rolls or whatever else, which is just plain not true. You basically just had some encounters that worked differently depending on how your dice rolls went. Like, for example, if you end up getting ambushed, you roll some dice to see how many rounds you're essentially stuck not acting. Or in the case of, like, let's say you avoided the ambush, and let's say you wound up in another situation where you caught them by surprise, it would be a different story there. Or if there's fog on the field, it would end up affecting it that way. Like, it's more to it than you fail dice roll, you die. It's more like you are put at a disadvantage or an advantage, or stuff like that. Like, if there's a bunch of fog, melee characters will do better and range characters will suffer for a little while. That kind of stuff. So either way, there's some neat ideas going on there. I'm not going to say it's impeccably balanced or anything. It's one of those cases where it's clearly not meant to be. You're just sort of given a gigantic toolbox of different stuff to screw around with, and whatever happens, like, for example, by the time I got to the very end, the only character capable of, well, even harming the final boss there was the archer in the team, which, again, like I said, there's a lot of Tactics Ogre PSP in there. So obviously the archer is the heavy hitter, the caster is mostly there for buffs and debuffs, though they get the occasional chance to shine with some splash damage, and then the melee guy is just sort of trying his best, despite being the leader of the group. It's an interesting dynamic between the three. But anyway, so okay, let's get back to it. Obviously, there's going to be more to that whole equation. There's a lot of randomness to it, so the equipment that you get, the kind of dice rolls that you get, the way that you make use of all of those dice rolls will cause a lot of things to work differently. Like, for example, what I mentioned earlier about, the melee guy kind of struggling throughout the experience could very likely have just been due to the fact that he's that in my particular case, I wasn't seeing a whole lot of melee weapons showing up, meaning that when it came to what kind of specials he could equip off of his weapons and things, I wanted to stick with the one that gave him an AoE spin move, because a lot of you do have some kind of FFTA in there with your equipment having equipable skill slots. So, for example, like, you can go and upgrade one particular weapon, like, let's say it's got a spin move on there, and then you just keep upgrading that weapon every time you find a new one, just like you do Relics and Reborn. But then, you know, in other cases, you might want to swap out for something that's got a cooler skill on there. The stats don't necessarily matter as much, or at least that's the way it seems. As opposed to something like, you know, what kind of actions are available to you, what kind of weaknesses you can exploit. Like, it's funny because exploiting elemental weaknesses felt more like Reborn, but the debuffs felt more like PSP. It's interesting. That's the best way I can put it. It's an interesting kind of look into the mindset of what was going on in between the two versions, you know. And when I say that there's a lot of Tactics Ogre in there, I mean there's a lot of directly Tactics Ogre, but there's a lot of the usual, like, we just screwed around with some ideas here just to kind of see what worked. Like, for example, you have Spiral Scourge there as an ability, but instead of being something on a spear, it's something that the Minotaur can use on the entire party. Or, for example, you've got something like Eagle Eye available for your archer there, but it's available from a skill scroll that you can apply to a weapon, or use once, like it happened in my case, because I meant to put it on a bow of his, but he didn't have any free slots, and I was waiting for a better weapon to show up for him. And then the final boss happens, which it's not a very long game, just so you know. And I was like, well, I guess we'll just go ahead and burn our one Eagle Eye right here, because he only has 50% odds to hit the boss anyway. So either way, there's a lot of kind of debuff war kind of stuff going on there. Some might get a little bit annoyed by that. If you loved PSP Tactics Ogre or any of that, if you loved One Vision, you might see a lot of that kind of flavor in there, where there's a lot of just kind of throwing debuffs at each other back and forth, trying to make something crack to get something through, as it were. But then, like I said, you definitely saw a lot more of the kind of emphasis on elemental advantages at certain times, like you saw in like you see in Reborn and whatnot. It's interesting to see that a lot of the same kind of like racial bonuses applying and stuff like that. However, they're entirely different. Like, instead of you got your Umbras or your beasts and dragons and things like that, it's like goblins and minotaurs and what have you. So it's fun, It's a neat little romp. I don't know if I mentioned it yet. The entire story is told through figurines, so it is extremely D&D. You can, like, if somebody told me, like, personally, my kind of mental theory on this whole thing over how Crimson Shroud even came to be was that they were working on some assets or whatever else for something completely different, and somebody was just putting together a D&D campaign based on, some Tactics Ogre stuff or what have you, and they went and they created the maps, and they had some figurines put together, and then suddenly their boss kicks down the door like, hey, what about this $5 game project you're supposed to be working on? It's like, yeah, I totally got it right here, boss. And they just throw them their mock-ups for their campaign that weekend. 100% would believe that was the case, because that's exactly what you're looking at there. It's basically a bunch of like 3D zones, as it were, with your characters going through and their little figurines. And it's cute because their weapons and stuff will update as you go through. And it's just going and updating with the different equipment you've picked up, but otherwise they stay exactly the same, except for a few cases where they change poses. Like, not even contextually, it's like they had two different versions, and they're just like, which version can we apply for this particular situation to make them look more or less surprised or casual or what have you. It's, like I said, it's a very strange but fun way to kind of make everything happen. Like, a lot of the effects whenever somebody's being attacked or whatever else, could absolutely see somebody off screen with a flashlight just doing some flash effects. It's fascinating. If nothing else, it's just interesting to look at. Anyway, so yeah, I found it really charming, but it is what it is there. As far as the story goes, it's pretty solid. I would say there's a great job in terms of paying attention to kind of fleshing out a lot of the earlier stuff. You have little moments to kind of sit aside and talk with your party members, find out their stories and whatnot. There definitely was a lot more exploring their kind of character stuff earlier on. Later on, it felt like it was kind of rushing it a bit, which again, it's not a super long game. It felt like the kind of thing that could be cooked up in a few weeks. But it wasn't a very long game. But it did feel like, for the practically nothing that it cost at the time, It was a pretty decent experience. There's definitely emphasis paid to trying to make it more replayable, like especially the fact that you can't get a good ending on your first time through, which is kind of interesting. Cam is a little bit of a surprise. I thought that just picking up a thing or not picking up a thing was what decided that ending. Turns out no, you just you got to go through on New Game Plus and approach it from a completely different direction, which is kind of a cool way to approach it. Usually, this is how the apocalypse starts, is not how, not really how you expect your game to end, especially after all of the big heroic build-up up to that point, and they're like, yeah, your chump ass didn't make it out of there. It's just interesting to see that approach. So they got a good bit of intrigue going on as far as, one person from the outside telling the story of what everybody was doing inside. Again, it kind of... honestly, personally, I feel like while I'm sure there's details I missed, it kind of falls on its face a little bit in terms of how exactly were they in multiple places at once. But either way, I think it's mostly intended as a just kind of nod along and go with it kind of situation. Again, it's clearly not exactly the most grand thing in the world, so to speak. It's just there to try to kind of explore mechanics and what have you. And again, you see a whole lot of stuff that later would come back for Reborn, like you kind of saw where they started experimenting with Meditate working a bit more randomly, where in this case it was something that you could trigger, but it worked off a dice roll, which is funny because I literally heard somebody saying, hey, why didn't they use this kind of system for Reborn? Yeah, the Reborn system is way more controllable. It basically, like in this case, you would go pick up your skill cards, and you have a set amount that Meditate was giving you. So you were controlling the odds that Meditate would trigger based on positions that you've captured. So that's kind of interesting in its own way. But the version that Crimson Shroud uses is basically a dice roll, and then depending on the rank of the skill, you get more dice. And you're basically using... it does use a kind of sort of version of the RT system, wherein they're going to be... do I want to go that way? I think not. Where they're going to be kind of just throwing a bunch of dice out there to... oh, actually, he's super weak to that. Going to be throwing a bunch of dice out to determine whether or not, they're getting a whole bunch of MP back or basically nothing. I forget if I mentioned it in this take or not, but it basically was like, well, are you getting 20 back or are you getting 100? Like, it varies pretty wildly. It's not quite that extreme, but it's still pretty close. But either way, there's a lot of stuff to kind of go back and re-explore and what have you. It's not the fanciest thing in the world, but again, $5, and right now it's available for a discount price of free $99 if you know where to look. So there's that. Anyway, so if you are curious what happened between the different versions of Tactics Ogre, you might see a whole lot of interesting stuff going on there. You might see a lot of fun takes on ideas that you're wondering like where they might have come from, where they might have evolved from, because clearly they were already thinking about some ideas back then. I find it especially funny that by the time New Game Plus rolls around, you basically can have every one of your characters operating like a reborn hoplite. You can just basically opt in for different skills on your different characters, which will result in funny things like, oh yeah, I just want Nullify Magic and Nullify Physical on everybody, please. Needless to say, this, there's a lot of stuff that's pretty abusable. Again, I still find it a little bit funny that by far the Archer is, like, it's not even close in terms of power. It's like, by the very end, just to give you an idea, like, despite hoping that the caster character is going to be the most powerful by far, and again, this might just be based off items, so take this with a grain of salt, but like, with the caster lady, by the time it got to the very end, I was generally seeing that neutral damage was kind of doing the most in her case, so I had her stick with detonation, which was basically like a physical damage explosion, more or less, because you had to opt her in for one particular kind of attack. You basically had a couple of spell slots that were available on her staff, and that was more or less what she was attacking with. So while there were a bunch of different versions, generally I was seeing that she was always either doing a lot or a little, but was doing pretty okay when it came to using this detonation spell, so I was going and leaving that on her. So that's doing 1 with like 50% odds to hit on this final boss there. So I have the melee guy, who I was generally using more for a support role, So he's primarily breaking down enemy units, applying a lot of debuffs and what have you, and then attempting to use a spin move to just sort of get whatever damage he can get through on his other round, because you have two different skill lists that are going on there. So basically, you were looking at a case where like one skill list was more or less the equivalent of your old action moves to a degree, where it was usually stuff like meditate or what have you, stuff that you could directly trigger there. But at the same time, you started getting more and more kind of attack moves or debuff moves or what have you as it went on and on. In some cases, some recovery moves and things. Just what slots everything went into, it kind of dictated the kinds of stuff that everybody was doing. It seemed like your people could be built out in a lot of different ways. But anyway, so getting back to it here, though. So as you go through, you start seeing more and more of these cases where you're kind of just looking more at those big splashy AoEs, as it were. Whereas in some cases, like the Archer there, it's pretty much all about just the single target damage with the guy. Or after a certain point, it literally just becomes the Archer is an absolute god while everybody else is just trying to support the Archer. Which is, again, especially funny because he's supposed to be the joke character, so, look at that situation as you will. But he's like supposed to be the sort of a jokey rogue sort, but even with all debuffs and buffs stacked up, melee guy was doing 16 with a 50% chance to hit on this final boss. Meanwhile, in strolls the Archer there, rocking like 55 on one action, 65 on the second action. Like the guy's taking off an eighth of this thing's health bar every round. That being said, it was still actually a surprisingly difficult fight, but either way, it was just kind of interesting to see that going on, Anyway, so obviously I could rant on about this for a decent while. You may have potentially heard some reviews over it being, super random or what have you. It's really not. It's, like, as far as the randomness is concerned, there's a lot of dice rolls and things, but it's all manageable stuff. It's all going to be, like, I've heard one guy say that, the dice roll's wrong and you just die. That's a load of crap, to be completely blunt. It's more just advantages and disadvantages, or in the case of something like it's cool to see it, like I mentioned earlier, you get like fog rolls in, and then you have dice rolls to determine whether or not you manage to get out of the fog, or if you've managed to get close, if it's a long-range encounter, stuff like that. So either way, really interesting little experience. If you have a 3DS, go ahead and give it a bit of a look. If you don't have a 3DS, it's going to be more complicated, since 3DS emulation isn't exactly the most friendly thing in the world. I can't imagine that many things will have been optimized for something so niche, so there's that too. But yeah, definitely a fun experience though. Definitely worth giving a look if you're curious. And it's just interesting to see where some of those ideas have kind of evolved into for Reborn, where they might have settled on a lot of these mechanics. They were clearly in a board game set of mind, and I'm here for every second of it. I love when they do board game mechanics. Honestly, I think more games need to do board game mechanics. Like, that's what I loved about March of the Black Queen. It's what I love about the card system going on here. It's one of those things that was just super charming to me when it came to Crimson Shroud there. And yeah, just generally a fun time. So, y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care, and I will see you in whatever the next thing happens to be. All right, later.